Yeah, it's very nice to see everyone again, if only remotely. Such a shame that we weren't able to meet in person. I'm very excited to be able to share my findings with you today. We decided, so Sarah and I decided that I would speak first about the network results, and then she would talk about the work done at the Spark Centre in Sheffield, so the Sheffield Performer and Audience Research Centre. And then we'll have a small discussion between the two of us, reflecting on each other's work, and then we'll be open to questions and discussion from everyone. Is it probably a good time to already share my screen? Does that look right to everyone?
Yes.
Very good. Okay. Yeah, so I'm Gina Emerson, as many of you already know. I think there are a few people who are external to the network, so I will just introduce myself. I'm a musicologist, and for the last few years I've been a PhD candidate at the Hochschule für Musik und Theater in Hamburg. And I handed in my doctoral thesis between the experimental and the accessible, investigating the audience experience of contemporary classical music at the end of last year. And I was supervised by Reinhard Flender, who I can see is also in the call, and by Stephanie Pitts, who is at Sheffield and a colleague of Sarah's. And this work is actually the first large-scale study specifically on the audience experience of contemporary classical music. And I'm very grateful to the ULYSSES Network for facilitating this collaboration and giving me the opportunity to conduct this research. So by way of introduction to the topic, contemporary classical music is an art form that has long had a difficult relationship to audiences. And the possible causes for this situation include the musical languages adopted by post-war composers that many believe have alienated or may have alienated audiences. Also includes such reasons as also the deterioration of music education in schools, which rarely focuses on contemporary composition or contemporary composers, and also cuts to arts funding in general. The recent qualitative study of contemporary arts attendees, conducted by Sarah and Stephanie, reported that contemporary classical music was actually viewed as the most isolated contemporary art form when compared to visual arts, film, or theatre. A recent quantitative study of 3 CCM festivals in Europe reported that these institutions reproduce social inequality in that there's a core audience of educated elite audience members that reattend, and this remains constant despite outreach and education events put on by these institutions. And from an audience development perspective, in 2015, 62% of 36 CCM institutions in the UK who participated in a sound and music survey reported that their audience numbers had either remained the same or declined in the past season. While these different facets of the audience problem in CCM has been much discussed, there remains little research on how existing audiences experience CCM in the concert hall and what they value and appreciate about it. And my study aims to offer a multidimensional view of audiences' experiences with this music, providing insights relevant both to music sociology, but also to practitioners, and reports the results of an audience survey study conducted at 12 concerts in collaboration with the ULYSSES Network across 10 different countries. For today's presentation, I'll be taking you through some of my main findings as well as some background to the study. I'll be discussing such factors as age, educational background, and musical background. I'll go into some detail on the audience experience of first-time attendees to contemporary classical music concerts. I'll also look at audience tastes and perceptions of the genre, as well as a few other insights. And I'll be connecting these areas to practical recommendations and also discuss some future directions for research. But first, a few definitions to get out of the way. And what do I mean by contemporary classical music? Why am I choosing to use this term? I use this term to refer to music composed in the Western art music tradition by living composers, music that is typically notated, performed in the concert hall, and features instruments and musical forms that are common to this tradition, to classical music. And why do I choose to use this term over such terms as contemporary music or new music? Well, similarly to musicologist Sarah Collins, I find that these terms have a pretense of neutrality while in fact being intensely ideological. I find that they undervalue the contemporaneity that pop and other styles have, and instead imply that this, so the Western art music tradition, the new music written in the Western art music tradition, is the only type of truly new music. So I find this term to be a little bit more specific in that regard. And I also found that this slightly more detailed option, contemporary classical music, was the best for when choosing a term to put on a questionnaire and to open up conversations with audience members. Yeah. And a further definition, what do I mean by audience experience in my work? And audience experience research considers what audience members are thinking, feeling, and doing as a result of arts attendance. And it goes beyond such traditional focus areas as demographics or demographic comparisons. And I also go beyond this and expand this yet further in my work to include such aspects as tastes, perceptions of the genre under study, specific aesthetic experiences with specific works in the concert hall and at specific concerts, including those I've kind of put quite a strong focus on concerts with alternative formats, as I'll also describe in my findings later on, and institution-audience relationships. A further aspect to my definition of audience experience considers how social aspects and the aesthetic experience relate to each other in music reception. Essentially how the experience of this music by audiences in the live setting is modulated by socio-demographic factors and aspects of the concert format itself. And I also draw on another term, another idea from sociologist Gina when considering how to place my research. It's definitely there's a strong basis in music sociology and music psychology from my background, but there's also an interdisciplinary approach, and I follow her idea of a relational musicology in my work, which is her call for the boundaries between the subdisciplines of music studies to be loosened and for their approaches to more freely inform each other. So that was some background to the study. And now I'll give some further details of the actual empirical work. So I conducted a series of surveys at the institutions in the ULYSSES Network. No need to introduce these in a lot more detail here. But what was significant to me as a researcher was that the network includes a broad range of different types of CCM institution. There are festivals, composer academies, venues and ensembles, and also a considerable breadth in terms of institution size. And this makes it well suited as a field for exploring different CCM contexts. I conducted one survey per institution. This resulted in a sample based on 12 CCM concerts with an overall respondent count of 1,428. And the average response rate was 53.3%, which was very high across those concerts. And for comparison with another form of live music, I also conducted a smaller survey at 3 classical music concerts at institutions in the network. And sample size here was 670 audience respondents with an average response rate of 32.5%. The survey concerts all had a very clear CCM focus. Half or more of the program works for each concert were by a living composer, and all featured either a world or a country premiere. 7 concerts had some form of alternative format, so staging, an audiovisual feature, or some kind of form of audience participation, or an introductory event. I also looked to cover a range of musical styles within CCM. So yeah, these concerts ranging from Arvo Pärt, from new music by young composers, that's obviously the particular focus of many of the institutions in the Ulysses Network, and ranging then through to works by Fernie Howe, James Clark, on a different, so the full spectrum really of anything that could fall under contemporary classical music. The questionnaire featured 4 blocks of questions, a set of demographic questions, questions around cultural habits and perceptions of the genre of CCM, and then 2 sets of questions relating to the specific event that the audience member attended, giving their reasons for attendance and how they heard about the event, and then a set of experience ratings and responses to each individual piece. And this questionnaire was piloted at the Impulse Festival in February 2017. It was then altered and then used in that altered form for the remaining, for the main survey. In terms of sampling, all audience members were given an equal chance of filling out this questionnaire. It was typically in the local language, and I decided with then all of you who were organising the concerts which language would be most appropriate, and in international contexts, English was then used. And when analysing the data, I sought to offer both a macro and micro level view of the audience experience. So I obviously looked at general trends across the quantitative data. Then there were also a lot of qualitative comments that were left behind unprompted by audience members, and I analysed in a number of passages in the thesis. I analysed these in some depth, and then there were also case studies that I produced about specific concerts relating to alternative formats and certain patterns in reception. So, on to my findings. First, a demographic overview. The average age of the sample was 48 years. This is younger, quite significantly younger than your average classical music audience, for whom the average age would probably be around 60, and that was also the case for the classical sample that I took. But also a little bit older than a pop audience, which would range around more about 20 or 30 years. And what's particularly interesting about contemporary classical music and age is that there's a lot of heterogeneity in age. There's it could be almost unique in terms of musical genres, in that it can appeal to both quite young audience members and an older group. There's definitely very much an educated elite that I found among these audiences, and audience members who are very generally culturally engaged. So over half have a master's degree, and over a third attend more than 21 live music events a year. 84.3% had been at a CCM concert before, but there was a small group of first-time attendees, 217 of them. It's exciting that I was able to capture their experiences. And musical expertise was a particularly important factor, and I found that there was a very strong contrast in the level of musical expertise in among audiences by institution. in the network. Unsurprisingly, the most experts environments were Darmstadt and Time of Music, so composer academies, and the least expert were venues, which can offer obviously a larger range of concerts, in particular Flagey and St. Maltings. But yeah, these contrasts could be very stark. At Darmstadt, for example, over half of the audience is essentially a composer, a very high level of expertise, whereas at Flagey and St. Maltings, there were musical experts of any kind, not just specifically CCM experts, were very rare. And I found in general that musical expertise was a significant predictor of frequency of concert attendance in terms of CCM. So that essentially means that the higher someone's level of musical expertise, the more CCM concerts they visit. And it's actually interesting that musical education was a bigger factor in this than general education or general school and university education. And this expands existing research, which has tended to focus a lot on school and university education. The audience members in my sample most frequently listened to classical music. And this classical music wasn't even the most frequently chosen listening genre in very CCM-focused contexts. So at URCAM, at Time of Music, at Gaudiamus, even the audience members there most say that they most frequently listen to classical music, not contemporary classical music. Taste and age, once again, interesting points of comparison. All the respondents tend to have highbrow clusters of listening tastes. They pair an interest in contemporary classical music with classical music or with jazz, whereas under 35s tend to be more omnivorous in their musical tastes, mixing it with electronic dance music, hip hop, and other pop genres. And this connection to pop and other forms of music that some audiences make led me to, and also some of the comments that came through around this question and some of the other questions around CCM culture, led me to describe the genre as a high art subculture, in that it holds a contradictory position in the musical field. It has something critical or anti-mainstream about it, but yet it functions firmly within the institutions of high art. And different audience members value different aspects of it, and often by age. To take this point a little further, I looked at perceptions of the genre through using a word association task. And audience members could choose from this list of 15 adjectives. They could choose 3 that they felt best corresponded to their view of the genre. And from this, the term experimental was the most frequently chosen word. And this confirms insights from existing research, for example, by Stephanie Pitts, with smaller samples, in which audience members do similarly associate the contemporary or the new with experimental content and forms. Interestingly, the next most frequently chosen word was inspiring, indicating that for audiences, there's something about that creative act of producing new music that resonates with them and with their idea of what this genre means. It's notable that terms such as new and avant-garde were not very frequently chosen at all. And in the case of avant-garde, it may be fair to say that the term experimental has indeed replaced it in the discourse. Terms, the more negative terms, such as difficult, strange, boring, and different, were more frequently chosen by CCM newcomers, so those first-time attendees. The term elitist was not that frequently chosen, but when it was chosen by young professionals, so usually 18 to 24-year-olds who are composers or performers of CCM themselves, which could be an interesting result for the ULYSSES Network, who works a lot specifically with this group. And that kind of speaks to maybe who is frustrated with some of the elements of contemporary classical music and who it's reaching and who it isn't reaching. And I invited audience members to offer further associations, and I received in total 201, collected 201 further words and phrases. These covered 20 different categories, covering lots of things from newness, associating it with newness and the unexpected, ideas about what CCM means or what it could, what it kind of stands for and how it relates to 20th century music. Also lots of ideas about complexity. And you can look at all of those words on the report that's available on my website. But now to turn further to the experience of those newcomers in the sample. First-time attendees were more socially motivated to attend, more likely to attend with friends and family than to hear a specific piece or watch a specific performer. They felt significantly less communicated with by the performers than audience members who had been to a CCM concert before, and also significantly less informed about the music. In general, they gave positive responses to the music, but or to the individual pieces, but chose the terms strange and difficult to listen to more frequently. That by no means suggests that those are negative responses. Also, strange can also be a good thing, a good kind of strange, but that is still a notable result in terms of who is using those terms. And they certainly seem to use much more careful language to express opinions about the music when compared to experts. And I have a few examples of this. So the experts in the sample tend to use quite forthright language and be very firm in their opinions. But the newcomer experience seems slightly different. This event reinforces for me the idea of a music that is far too scientific and abstract. It arouses no emotions, it is directed at insiders. This music does not speak to me despite the very good quality. It is important that events like this can take place. I think contemporary classical music has been pushed to levels that make it difficult to comprehend. It needs too much knowledge or preparation to enjoy. I think what's notable here is that a lot of these newcomers use quite careful language. They say for me or to me, they make it quite specific that there might be other people who have more informed opinions, or the general opinion might be that this music is not scientific and abstract, but for them it is, and they feel kind of careful about saying that. And I think it's also interesting that there's this aspect that the whole idea can't really be questioned too much. It speaks to me despite the very good quality, even though it may have also been hard for the person to judge that quality or to understand what that means for them. And I had similar views expressed in the classical music sample. So in terms of encouraging newcomers to return, when asked how likely they would be to attend another CCM concert, newcomers were significantly less likely to return than those who had been before. And it seems that the quality of experience at the event is the most important factor in encouraging or in being likely to reattend, not that it emerges as being more important than demographic factors such as musical expertise or other interests. Works with extra musical features or with some kind of alternative format, whether that was staging, audiovisual elements, or audience participation. These works were perceived as most emotive, enjoyable, and engaging across all the pieces in the sample. And that was 33 pieces in total that I analysed responses to. And it appears that in many of these cases, there was a greater audience connection than for standard format works by the same composer and on the same program. And to give one example of this, this performance of a film music War Requiem by Olga Neuwirth at Snape Maltings in June 2017. This work was presented on a programme which began with 2 standard format works by Neuvert and then concluded with this audiovisual piece. And this work was perceived as significantly more emotive and significantly less strange than the 2 works before it. And while it's not really possible to pinpoint exact causes and effects in music reception and not in this form of survey methodology, the use of film is most likely to have been the reason for this shift in response. And I can give some examples here of the comments that emphasize the film and the music. So film and music was a very moving experience, a very moving and powerful experience. The film was a revelation and very moving. Not our normal musical fare, but very glad we came. Film footage was remarkable. The film element contributed enormously. And I found not only in this instance, but in another couple of audiovisual examples in the survey, that it appears that audience members often pick out aspects of the experience. Here there's quite a strong emphasis on the film, or only the film, in comments. In other places I found that too, that there was less of an idea of there being a complete work, but more of an emphasis usually on the visual. In some other places it was just on the musical experience. So which is quite interesting in terms of reception, of how maybe for the composer it's very clear how these elements fit together, but for the audience member there's a much more of a weight placed on one of those features. In terms of audience participation, the events that I surveyed with some form of participatory format highlight how involving audience members and granting them a form of agency can transform the audience experience. In Control by Alexander Schubert, presented at the Ultima Festival in 2018, audience members acted as participants in a chain of surveillance and command, following directions from performers and other audience members. Audience members could choose to participate or just observe the installation, and that gave me the opportunity to compare those 2 experiences. I found that participants were reported that their experience was significantly more memorable and more satisfying than those observing. This was also the youngest audience in the whole sample, an average age of 32, and the most omnivorous in terms of musical tastes, and also had among the highest proportion of CCM first-time attendees in the sample. So I give a second example. This concert by the Ensemble Divertimento featured a work for amateur choir by Gabriele Manca, alongside other works by Manca and by other composers. And this piece was considered the most emotive, enjoyable work on the programme, even despite the musical similarities to other works of Manca on the programme. And it seems here that I knew from the motivation question that many of the audience members knew someone who was performing or had come along because a friend or family member was part of that amateur choir. And that personal connection to the performers seems to have been an important element in the reception of the piece. And this was actually the work the concert and the whole sample that most extensively reached new audience members, reaching audience members that were new both to contemporary classical music and to the institution, so new to the Ensemble Divertimento as well. And these examples indicate how changing that usual relationship between audience and performer can indeed bring something else to the audience experience, and also very much shift who actually attends and shifts demographically how the audience looks. And finally, just a few notes on that smaller classical music audience sample. Classical audiences view CCM more negatively than CCM audiences, as might be expected. And their most frequently chosen word on the same word association task was challenging, and then they used the word experimental. Living composers seem to deter classical audiences from deciding to attend specific programs. So I offered a list of composers, and they were asked the hypothetical question of whether they would attend or how likely they would be to attend if a work by that composer was on the program. And it also seems that the names of younger, foreign, and less established composers were a particular deterrent. In some cases, unfamiliarity with living composers and also with 20th century composers was very high. And this also shows how different audiences at a single institution can be very isolated from one another, because it was always a concept from a classical audience and a contemporary classical audience being compared at one institution. So those three institutions were the Estonian Philharmonic Chamber Choir, Snape Maltings, and Flagey. So on to my conclusions. It is first and foremost that receiving newly composed music in the concert hall is a complex task. There are many factors that are in consideration while audiences are sitting and silently listening. There are many aspects that actually shift the experience of the musical content. My results lay the groundwork for a sociology of CCM culture that I hope could be taken up by in further research and by other researchers. And this term high art subculture is a first step in defining patterns of behavior, or kind of how the position of this music in the musical field. And it was found that this music is very much defined by a tension between, on the one hand, the experimental, the more radical, and on the other hand, the accessible. There are contexts in which different aspects of this music are valued, and those often vary then by musical expertise. So in expert contexts, there's more likely to be a kind of less of a willingness to compromise, or a kind of radicalism at all costs kind of environment. And in other places, there might be more relaxed attitudes and more diverse programming. And there certainly are differences in terms of how experts and newcomers voice their opinions, whether they are energized by the complexity of this music or challenged by it or irritated. There are lots of different experiences there happening along that spectrum of the experimental and the accessible. And I have now a few recommendations to institutions based on my research. And clearly the audience for CCM is in most places still an educational elite, and there are expert environments in which newcomers feel insecure. And while live audiences might seem particularly distant at this time, I still think it is a good time to reflect on audience-related practices. While the results definitely show that the vast majority of audience members had attended a CCM concert before, at every concert there was a small percentage that hadn't. So it's important to think about everyone who might turn up to a concert that you're organising. And in general, non-musicians and amateur musicians were in the majority overall. Taking risks with format, and perhaps also engaging locals or related institutions close to your institution, or amateur musicians, all seem to be fruitful ways of connecting with audiences differently. Works that involved some form of deviation from that normal concert format attracted audience members that had different characteristics from the rest of the sample. And such pieces were received differently as well, tend to be more positively, or have some form of deeper experience from my respondents. And it seems that there is a fair amount to be gained from taking on projects that are unconventional or possibly more informal in format, which could outweigh those costs, benefits which could outweigh those costs and time involved in producing them. While I didn't get more time to talk about those general associations with, or those further associations with CCM, that choosing that word inspiring in many cases for those audience respondents indicates that there's this kind of connection to creativity that for audience members, and also that many associate it with innovation and experimentalism. Wanting to hear works by young composers or wanting to stay up to date with current music were often mentioned as motivations for attendance. And it seems like the creative process can be a site of interest for audience members. So I'd recommend finding opportunities for composers and performers to connect more directly with their audiences. And I think the ULYSSES Network, with working particularly with young composers, is in a unique position to do this. And finally, curating across genres and art forms can be an effective means of changing up demographics, given that people come to CCM from different musical angles. I know this is something that a lot of interdisciplinary institutions already do, but more consideration along these lines could be fruitful and could help combat the view that CCM is closed off or isolated from other types of music and contemporary art. I'm sure this is something that Sarah will be able to talk a bit more about. So in terms of kind of limitations of the study and possible directions for future research, it's evident that in some areas the audience members in my sample are too positive or gave primarily positive answers, and this is something that all audience researchers struggle with. But it's interesting to consider from an institutional perspective, how can we get audience members to give honest, open and critical views about their arts attendance experiences, not just saying that they had a good time. And that's probably relates to creating a kind of environment that does allow for that more honest reflection. There's also, of course, quite a high degree of self-selectivity, because audience members could, of course, decide freely to participate in the study. Those who are more likely to complete questionnaires are overrepresented in my study, or could also be more dedicated audience members are also most likely to be overrepresented. So the question here is how to reach newcomers more effectively and how to elicit their responses. Further research could look at using something such as a sense of belonging rating to further investigate CCM subculture and look at feelings of being an insider or an outsider. It could be interesting to compare audience responses and composer intentions, and the memorability of the event at different time points after it had occurred, so a couple of weeks later or longer, would be another way of looking at the audience experience. I'm almost done, just a few more final thoughts to come, but the book version of the thesis is in preparation, due in summer or autumn next year, in the second half of next year, and will be published by Routledge. But in the meantime, you can still access that report at ginaemerson.net at my website. And I'll just have a few final thoughts to leave you with today. I think it's important to work to empower audiences across all contexts. Not everyone has to open up their environment to, or their institution to, new audience members. That doesn't have to be everyone's aim, but you can think about how to change up how you present this music, and offering those who are curious a way of accessing it that allows for honest reflection and for being critical. And it's important to be led by audience experience and seek to build meaningful relationships with audiences, so not just hoping that more of them will come, but also hoping that the quality of that relationship is good. I think we're still quite a long way from CCM being an art form for everyone, and that doesn't, we can discuss whether that has to be the aim, which doesn't have to be. But perhaps it's interesting to think more about balancing experimentalism and accessibility. And on that note, I'll leave you with a comment from one of those young professionals in the sample, who is also one of those who viewed the art form as elitist and reported that. And she says that it's stupid, but I don't want it to be this way. I love this music and I wish we did it differently. Thank you. But I would at this point then hand over to Sarah.
Oh, thanks so much, Gina. That's what an exciting project, and how incredible to hear from almost 1,500 audience members for contemporary music. I think I was frantically scribbling notes the whole way through that, because I think you'll all hear lots of similar points being raised again through the research that I'm going to talk about, and so many points of comparison. So I'm aware that it's quite hard to keep concentration for a long time on these kind of Zoom calls. It's so much worse than in person. So I'm going to talk reasonably briefly, and I will share this PowerPoint through there's anything more that you want to ask me about or any more detail, then you can feel free to get in touch, but I'll try and keep it quite lightweight at the moment. Brilliant. So just a little bit about me and the work that I do. So as Gina said, me and Stephanie Pitts, who was Gina's other supervisor, we head up the Sheffield Performer and Audience Research Centre, which is essentially the two of us and then other academics as we get kind of projects where we're able to work with different people in different organisations. We have this kind of research cluster. And for the last 10 years, we've been working firstly on classical music audiences, but in recent years really spreading that out to look more widely across arts and culture. So our previous collaborations have been quite a lengthy collaboration with Music in the Round, who are a chamber music promoter based in Sheffield but promoting all around the country, and the City of Birmingham Symphony Orchestra, with whom I did my collaborative PhD, looking at their audiences and their views on kind of art and entertainment, so those kind of fizzy populist programs that you get at symphony orchestras. Today, what I'll be talking about is a project that we wrapped up in February called Understanding Audiences for the Contemporary Arts. And the fact that we finished in February didn't seem very significant at the time, but now it means that we very much finished before COVID kind of became this thing that was going to change our whole lives for this year. So actually at the moment, Stephanie and I are working on a project looking at the impact of COVID on arts and culture. So I will happily take any questions on that in the discussion at the end. But for now, we're going to be looking at this research that happened before the pandemic. So Understanding Audiences for the Contemporary Arts was a multi-art form project that took place across 4 UK cities. It started with a question from Tim Rushby, who is part of Birmingham Contemporary Music Group. And he said, okay, you've done all this research on classical music audiences, but we think contemporary music audiences are a bit different. We think they might have more in common with people who go to contemporary art, or maybe who go to new writing in theatre or contemporary dance. So we've spent a lot of the last kind of 3 years really trying to get to grips with this question of, is there a certain type of person, a certain type of audience member who finds all those words that Gina was just using, challenge, experiment, new, they find that the most exciting thing to go to. And to explore this, we did 187 in-depth interviews, really sitting down with people for the best part of an hour and talking to them about all of these different contemporary art forms. What was so interesting about this project is that we would recruit people who were interested in different art forms. So we'd go to an experimental dance performance and we'd go and find some people to talk to, and we talk to them about what it is that they loved about contemporary dance. And then we say, okay, now tell me about contemporary music. Now tell me about visual art. So you really kind of found those people who aren't necessarily passionate attenders of all of these art forms, but kind of pick and choose between them. So just as a kind of quick background, we know quite a lot already about why people don't go to contemporary music concerts. How I like to group this is that it kind of clusters around 3 areas. One is about difficulty, so feeling like I don't know where to start, I don't know what I'll enjoy. You'll see again that sense of needing to be prepared and educated, so reminiscent of those comments that Gina's audiences gave her. Also a feeling of I'm just sitting there for it could be 15 minutes, it could be an hour, just listening. What's everyone else doing? Are they hearing something that I'm not hearing in this? And questions around whether you should be trying to really kind of intellectually engage with it and understand it, or let yourself be moved, and actually whether or not it's okay to be distracted or to daydream. Now, as kind of people who maybe have grown up with classical music, I'll take this personally. I feel like any one of those is absolutely fine, and sometimes I'll go to a concert and experience it in one way, and other times I'll think, oh, you know what, I daydreamed most of the way through that. But for someone coming in for the first time, they can be quite caught up on what it is that they're meant to be doing and whether they're doing things in the right way. The other thing that we know is incredibly off-putting is just not knowing how to behave at concerts. So not knowing whether or not it's going to be okay to clap and when that should happen, being really self-conscious about whether or not you're making any noise, and even just things like, what do I do in the interval? Can I take a drink in? All of those are quite off-putting if that's something that you're really not familiar with. And then finally, elitism. So the fact that we still have a culture around classical music where articles can appear like this, where someone says, oh, they're putting rap at the BBC proms, how this is dumbing things down. The fact that those opinions are still out there and still get media coverage means that people can see and be aware that there are people in the classical music industry who aren't okay with it opening up in the way that it is. And of course, with that goes feelings of I don't know if I belong, I don't know if there's going to be people like me there. Maybe everyone is middle class or posh, maybe everyone is white, maybe everyone's older. Is that for me? Am I going to stick out like a sore thumb? So those are kind of things that we know from a lot of literature that's come before. Certainly in doing this contemporary arts project, because we talked to people about all different parts of culture, we found that, as Gina mentioned, classical music is really out on a limb, in that people felt like it was an art form that needed a really concerted effort to get into. That was quite different to visual art, where contemporary visual art has a lot more kind of prominence. Things like Damien Hirst and Tracy Emin, there's quite famous visual art that's out there that's contemporary, and so there's a bit more of awareness of it. And also galleries are kind of easier places to be able to just pop in and out, even if that's just to go and have a nice cup of coffee in the cafe and to use the clean toilet. Actually, they're more accessible spaces, certainly where they're free, as so many are in the UK. Theatre has lots of connections to film and TV, so you may know certain directors because they've directed your favourite, series, or there's a particular actor, or they may be related to kind of books or plays that you might have studied or you might have read. in that way, classical music just felt like it was that little bit less accessible. And so the routes into it were really tangible. They were tended to be associated with parents being interested, participating in it yourself. I'm aware of time, so I'm just going to skip through a little bit. So attitudes to contemporary music, are they, as Gina mentioned, are they accessible or are they inaccessible? Well, when we asked people about contemporary classical music, a lot of people didn't really know it was a thing. So they said, oh, isn't that a bit of an oxymoron? Or what kind of music do you even mean by that? And if you started to try and unpick it, often the reference points were either kind of 60s minimalism. So people were far more aware of Steve Reich and Philip Glass. Or if people were more into quite alternative, kind of popular indie electronic music, then they knew of people like Niels Fram and Anna Meredith. There were a lot of stereotypes around contemporary music. You've already heard experimental and challenging being said, but we also have some things like abstract and cold, and it sounds like they're just mucking around and making noises. And I'm sure we've probably all had a friend or a relative say that to us at some point. But actually there was a really common theme that went through all art forms, that was about not being able to see the skill involved in creating contemporary artworks. So Tracy Emin's Unmade Bed was an absolute classic example of that. I can't, that's what I do every morning. What's so special about that? And with that, not being able to discern the meaning of it. So not hearing that kind of communication. What is the artist trying to say to me? What are they trying to make me feel? Are they just trying to be weird for the sake of it rather than actually trying to communicate? And so what can we do about connecting new audiences with new music? Well, with classical music as a whole, one thing we can do that's incredibly powerful is making a concert into an experience. And I mean, I think that hits the nail on the head of what Gina was saying about those concerts that have films involved or where people can go and participate. We quite often in classical music, maybe not contemporary classical, but classical music, when we're trying to sell concerts, we talk about how amazing this interpretation is going to be. And you're going to come and you'll hear something new for the first time. But actually, those are quite appealing to experienced listeners. If you're someone who has never been to a concert of any kind of Western art music before, they aren't particularly appealing concepts, because, hearing, that particular conductor performing this piece, well, if you've never heard the piece before, it doesn't really matter to you who's conducting it. So what we can do is instead try and focus on, why is this going to be a kind of special experience that you're going to remember? And so that's making a night of it, encouraging people to do things like go out for drinks and dinner and make it this really special occasion. We can emphasize the spectacle of seeing, especially if you think about a symphony orchestra, seeing 100 musicians on stage is an incredible spectacle if you've never seen it before. And emphasizing that you'll be in the same room with them, you can watch them playing, and also that you're going to be part of an audience who are all watching that together. We can also think more about changing the venue. So taking classical and contemporary music out of concert halls is a really powerful way of kind of disrupting who the usual audience are. And it's because all of this, the formality of how do I behave, tends to be really strongly linked to venues. So if you do something like non-classical do, where in London they put our new music once a month in a gig room at the back of a pub. So most of the time it's rock bands and kind of, it's quite dingy, it's kind of metal. And instead they've got a quartet in there. Well, I know if I'm in a bar, that means I'm allowed to have a drink. I'm allowed to walk away if I want to. It sets up different expectations for whether or not you can have a quiet conversation with the person next to you. And so it kind of disrupts that preciousness And I love this quote where someone said, you know, I love the fact that I can hear the glass dishwasher going at the same time as hearing this music. It makes it so much less formal. And we've generally found in music across genres that people are very attached to types of venues. So people in these interviews would often really struggle to describe what genre of music they like, but they could tell me that, oh, I go to music that's in concert halls, I go to music that's in pubs, I go to music that's in kind of grassroots DIY venues. And so we've started using this phrase a lot of context is the new genre, where actually that sense of I'm in a place where I feel comfortable, I belong, it's people like me, and I can trust that venue to put on the kind of music that I want to listen to. That's an incredibly powerful kind of driver of why people go to different kinds of performances. And then another thing that came out as a really defining feature of people who want to go to experimental and contemporary works rather than traditional works is that they walk in with an attitude of it's okay not to like this. So it's okay if I don't like this one because I'll like the next one. It's okay if I don't like this piece because I'm still really glad that it's been made. And I think this links quite a lot, Gina, to the positive evaluation phenomenon. I think some of it is just really inherent to contemporary audiences, that they're so keen that this work happens and that the artists are encouraged to make the work. Someone said, you know, that they can just put down whatever it is that's in their head, that they can try and not have to be beholden to, you know, commercial revenues and things like that, that they're just really happy that this work is being made. And so these the kind of curiosity was really linked to a sense of responsibility, that I need to turn up so that that work keeps being made, whether or not it's exactly my taste. And just kind of to round up on that note, I wanted to highlight a really successful initiative that we found at Birmingham Contemporary. And so this is somewhere between a kind of audience membership scheme and a crowdfunding scheme, where audiences directly contribute to the commissioning of new music. And for the period where it's being written and rehearsed and then performed, they are invited, they're given updates and newsletters, they're invited to come to rehearsals, and they're kind of publicly recognised at the concert. And this seemed to, for the sound investors that we spoke to, this was a really important route into contemporary music that they hadn't necessarily been involved with before. And it was because it tapped into their desire to contribute and to make sure that music survived and that they were playing their part in making sure that people had a career. They liked feeling welcomed and belonging, and not just belonging, but belonging to a group of people who were all there really willing to give every piece a good go. It wasn't like sitting amongst a classical music audience where you think, oh, as soon as that piece by a living composer comes on, everyone's going to switch off and hate it. They were all really willing to like it, or at least to try. But they also really valued that proximity to the moment of creation. And that was something that was seen incredibly strongly with the sound investors, but beyond that to a far greater audience of people just wanting to be at, people described it as like wanting to be at the birth of a new work, just being so excited by the idea that no one had ever heard or seen this before. But with that, the rehearsals in the Sound Investor scheme meant that they could still build up a familiarity with the piece, so they weren't coming in cold. Because we know with a lot in contemporary music, in classical music, that being more and more familiar with a piece tends to mean that people enjoy it more. But that mixture of kind of altruism or philanthropy and personal satisfaction is kind of woven through the accounts of all of our audience members. And there was a really strong desire to support organisations that were doing work that they agreed with. In the same way that certainly in the UK, we've had this big push towards shopping local and shopping at independent places rather than chains. It was talked about in a very similar way, that this was a place that people really wanted to put their money. They wanted to make good decisions with where they spent their money. And this was strongly linked to an understanding that the cultural industries are really exclusive, and there are a lot of people who are not represented there. It's very white, it's very middle class. There are some places which it's still very male as well. And so by choosing contemporary works, actually they were choosing to support artists that were underrepresented in that area, or support young artists that needed a break. So yeah, that's pretty much all from me, other than just to leave you with questions of what it is that we're trying to do when we develop audiences. Are we trying to get bigger audiences, different audiences? There's this approach that I hope we're kind of past now, but it's known colloquially as the drug dealer approach, in that you hook them in with something easy and accessible, and then slowly try and get them onto the harder and harder stuff. And I think we need to think quite differently about audience development in terms of programming a range of different things for a range of different audiences. And as Gina mentioned, those amateur concerts can be a huge pull to a very different type of audience, as can things that are more experience-based and participatory. So if we are serious about getting a different kind of audience into our contemporary classical music concerts, then I think variety is the key, and we should be particularly thinking about this while we're all kind of paused for COVID. What is it that we want to make in the future, and who is it that we want to connect with? Great. That's everything from me. You can read this in our book that's now out, which is quite exciting. It's also very expensive, not quite as expensive as an ebook, but there is also a free handbook that's very pretty with lots of photos in, that I will also share the link for, that yeah, anyone can download. So yeah, thanks ever so much.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was fantastic. Anne, I'm just wondering how we're doing for time. We said that we would end at 7. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Yes.
So
Should we just have a kind of general Q&A then?
Yes.
Great.
So
yeah, I would suggest that.
So we have 20 minutes left for questions.
I have a general remark. This is not meant as a criticism, but just as an observation. I think that when we replace what contemporary music has tried to accomplish, and if we try to replace that in a historical context, so for example, when we think of Ars Nova, which was a period during which people at the time tried sort of very experimental, advanced, hard to understand, for example, rhythmic writing and so forth, which was not immediately accepted, but sort of slowly sunk into the musical language as time passed. I sort of think more and more that the goals of contemporary music is somewhat in that vein, because I also think that, for example, in contemporary music, or in music in general, there's a kind of a spiral effect over time, where composers revisit certain aspects of music. So if I take let's say a simple example of the notion of, for example, in musical composition, writing for space. So you have, for example, Gabrieli being one of the first people who experimented with writing for space at the St. Mark's Cathedral in Venice. And then sometime later, you have Wagner with his approach to thinking about space, different, but still, in a sense, he's still thinking about space in the way of how Bayreuth was conceived. And then you have the modern experimentations of space with Stockhausen and many other composers. So I think sometimes we have this impression that contemporary music is somehow going to be some kind of like a continuity, a phenomenon that has some kind of continuity. But in fact, it's kind of a point in time where, let's say, composers stop and think about their craft, their language, the language of music, and then maybe this is not so this is not accepted, let's say, not so well accepted directly at the time, but what has been done sort of finds its way into the music in the decades that follow. So, for example, if you come back to Ars Nova, some of the ideas that were put on the table, so to speak, at the time, were not so well accepted either by musicians or the public at the time. But many of the ideas slowly found their way into musical writing over the following decades and centuries. So I think that this question of looking at the acceptance of contemporary music should also be put into some kind of historical perspective, and maybe derive a strategy from that, saying we defend our 20th century or 21st century Ars Nova mission, and we don't expect that it's going to be as popular as Michael Jackson, but we are doing something which is important for the evolution of musical language. So that's my small comment, which was not meant as a criticism or saying that you overlooked anything or anything, but that's just sort of a comment.
Do you mind if I come back on that? I think you're right. I think there's in anything kind of new and experimental, there's always going to be a kind of lag before. We talk all the time about people being ahead of their time, and so I think you're right that in some sense there's a period of time, and then certain things are kind of picked up and there's more popularity in them. I still think
I think that the question of popularity, for me, that there's several terms which I find very bothersome when we're discussing contemporary music. First of all, I think the idea of avant-garde is a stupid idea, because you're saying that this music is ahead of, or it's a progress over something else. I mean, I prefer thinking in terms of something has widened the musical vocabulary as being a positive contribution, rather than being a superiority remark vis-a-vis some other kind of music. And the other thing is the question of popularity. I mean, I believe much more in the concept of a kind of resonance that is created over time. I mean, Schoenberg was right when he said we are always overruled by history, which is the way to say that what we think is a great idea, maybe it won't have any resonance, or an idea that we find mediocre surprisingly has a resonance, over time.
Yeah, no, I think resonance is a really good word here. I guess my only kind of pushback on that would be that I think we need to decide whether or not we take seriously how exclusive this music still is. And I think even if you go a few decades on from someone who, you know, perhaps wasn't getting recognition at the time, or yeah, wasn't kind of resonating with their time, and who is that finding resonance with? And I would argue that I think a lot of the time it's still with the same kinds of people. And there might be, like I said, with minimalism suddenly kind of really breaking out of that, you might find moments where it does. But I think in an age where we are really focusing on inclusion and diversity and ways in which people are pushed out of spaces, and I just think, I guess, yeah, it goes back to my end point. We need to think how seriously we see our mission to include lots of different people in this kind of culture that we have. And that might not be for everyone to try and widen that out. But if we're serious about widening that out, then we need to pay attention to which kinds of pieces and experiences are resonating with people.
But sorry, if you're talking about diversity, why don't we just accept that there is so much out there that we don't need all the worlds to go for one sort or genre of music? I mean, the notion of diversity would exactly lead to an acceptance that there's different groups of people who are interested in different sort of things, yeah, and of course we want to expose them to it, or we want to offer things, yeah, but we can also accept that it must not necessarily be for open for everyone or interesting for everyone. This is what I understand with the wording of diversity, to also accept, yeah.
Yeah, I think if I can add a comment, which in a sense goes in the direction of what Jutta says. I mean, I think that also, in a sense, contemporary music felt at some point that it was inventing the mainstream of tomorrow, and I think that didn't turn out, and that didn't turn out simply because the population of the world has exploded. The diversities of culture and the ease of communication between different groups, for better or worse, has exploded, and so there's this enormous phenomenon of fragmentation. And so I think that what Jutta says is absolutely right. Is that, you know, we're more in I think maybe more in a society where we have fragments which come together and move apart as you know, as time goes on. So I think that's important, that we say that, you know, we can't have the illusion that somehow what we're doing is going to be accepted by everybody.
I think just
no, go on. Sorry.
No, it's just, I was going to kind of come back to your point on, if we feel like classical music, contemporary music is replicating and supporting inequalities, because it is historically an incredibly white and middle class, and actually male as well, genre. So it, again, if it feels like it, which it does to me, it feels like it supports, or at least is not challenging, social inequalities, then is that a system that we want to just keep perpetuating in the same way?
But do you find mathematics exclusive as well? And excluding? For example, I don't want to compare it totally, yeah, but if we break it down to the point that not everyone is understanding everything, and this would be very unfair to society. I think we can go into 100 of topics and just state the same thing.
I might jump in on some of these points. Yeah, I mean, I think this is all, and hello, Uta. Yeah, I think that there are lots of different aspects to this to the debates, and I also think it is fine to say that yeah, this music doesn't have to be for anyone. There is always a kind of reflection there, and your point on something like mathematics or on academic research. There's a point that a lot of this stuff is obviously publicly funded or uses taxpayers' state money, and I think there is a connection to seeing it, to what extent this public is then reflected in audiences that come to contemporary music, and that point also is just true of academic research, which is finally doing its best with open access to actually get results out to the wider public. So I think there's a parallel there, and I think that's definitely one. It can be some people's aims, but it doesn't have to be everyone's aims, and I think it's fair, and it's a good idea just to also recognize like a diversity in also viewpoints across different contexts of CCM. I think it's this art form is almost unique in just how in all its different incarnations and all the different ways it appears and is presented. I think that is in itself also a good thing and a richness, and I think that there should be people working at all sorts of different levels at it, and it being received on different levels. I think that's important, but maybe just that for people who want to come from a different angle and experience it for the first time and move from one level to another, that they feel able to. But to your point, Andrew, I would also say that yeah, it's interesting to think from an audience kind of view, maybe those expert audiences of today, maybe they are a kind of form of
what happened?
Am I, can I be heard, or am I too loud? Or too, okay. I think this happens occasionally. It could be that the expert audiences of today are in some ways a kind of early adopter of certain of more experimental musical languages, of different musical forms, and that's also something you could look at a bit more in future research, whether to what extent that applies to other aspects of their kind of behaviors or their interests. Are they interested in kind of experimentation along lots of different lines in terms of the other kinds of art forms they're interested in, or in other kind of interests or behaviors? I think there's also room for looking at personality in that. That would also be relatively interesting to see what kind of person that is, and who is particularly interested in musical innovation.
Well, the thing I was saying was actually, quite general, because I mean, for example, if we forget about music for a moment and think about photography, there are moments where in the photographic world there were photographers who tried simply new ways of photographing, and they developed new elements of vocabulary in photographic practice. But that didn't necessarily make them, popular or accepted at the time that they did it. But as the subsequent generations of photographers look back at what these people said, the ideas, some of the ideas creep in and become a part of the, part of the language. And I just think that that's a sort of a natural aspect of the development of creation in various artistic fields. The only thing I think that it's important not to lose sight of that. That's all. I mean, like I was saying something very simple.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, completely. And I think it's also stands in relation to that the reception history of contemporary music in the last 100 years or so is still quite underdeveloped, and there is still, as you say, too much of a focus, I think, on musical progress, on this kind of like forward motion or vertical motion rather than this horizontal widening of musical vocabulary. And that's something that I think musicology also needs to think about more, or thinks about how we even write music history, and who is considered important, or what is considered an important innovation, and what is then reported about still needs to kind of change and be thought about more in that horizontal direction that you described.
And I think that, and then I'll shut up because I've talked too much. I think that the question of, you know, these sort of waves over time, where the people think about the elements, you know, of the language of their métier. I mean, it's just something that goes on, and it doesn't have anything to do with, you know, whether people are, you know, of whatever social section or not. You know, I mean, you know, certain ideas have a kind of a certain force of their own, and they will develop in whatever circumstances makes it possible for them to develop.
I would like to jump in a bit, and because I think we are probably, I mean, it's from an exciting point here is now we've been talking very much about audiences. And on the other hand, of course, what could be exciting from the research, sort of like what you got out from that, Gina, is in the sense that so much of our within Ulysses are, of course, composers, musicians, and creators. So in fact, you very much researched the audience, of which the majority is in fact a professional audience. And so on based of this, I think the big exciting things would be sort of understand between the lines of your research, how much do you find a concern with the young generation or awareness of the young generation about these issues about audiences and the importance? How do they react to that? Because in that sense, we are in the middle of many different time shifts. I mean, we are from sort of like the Cold War ideological, aesthetical discussion. We are going over to identity politics. That's the last 50 years. We are basically, when we are talking about audiences, what the audiences were in Darmstadt in 1960s is a totally different thing what the audiences are nowadays, and so on, and what they identify with. And then simultaneously, we are having really this sort of like, now with COVID, I think we are sort of getting from this sort of reaching out, audience engagement. We're probably in the middle of a big time shift, which is really discussing artistic relevance. Are the big numbers always the indicators of success, or will there be other things that are of value? So, and I really think that the next 2 years will be enormous sort of like change of what matters, because everything will be just for the next year's bonkers. And we can't really actually reach the same things in the sense. So any sort of thoughts what you think on basis of this? Before that, I could give a good funny example. When I was teaching at Columbia University, music history, and we went through from beginning to end. And when we got to Piero Lunaire, I had an Afro-American student who thought that the first time the music started to have any relevance to him. So he got back with me with the version, own sort of modern rap that he had done on Piero Lunaire, and he thought that was the first time it started to get relevance for him. Just as example that we are never really sure about how people react to things nowadays in the classical way.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that anecdote, and how, yeah, sometimes people also just need to develop a personal relationship, or kind of bring music into a different context, into a musical context that makes sense to them, and then access it through that. I think that's relevant. I think that also applies to, in general, just how people come to this music. Is just there's so many different ways, and so through those there are so many connections to electronic music and experimentalism in that field, that opens up so many ways in which people suddenly come across something more abstract or something slightly different that they wouldn't have otherwise done. And I think there's so much potential in that, for sure. Yeah, I think that your comments on COVID and all this obviously so relevant. This is such an interesting time to actually think about what the role of the live audience is. Like, what is its point? What does it add? What does it mean when people now perform without a live audience and with some distant remote audience? Is that still a performance? Does it still feel like a performance to those performers? I think those are points for research that I think maybe also Sarah is also getting into in her study. Maybe she can follow me on that. And as to what the expert audiences or the composers in the sample thought of audiences and thought of these issues, certainly, as I mentioned, a lot of those younger, those in their early 20s who are young professionals, often indeed at time of music or at Darmstadt, used the questionnaire as a space to talk a lot about these exact issues, that feeling a sense of frustration with what is programmed, also with who attends, and expressing a desire for it to be somehow done differently. Often this was only expressed as broadly as that and not more specifically. I know that I remember one respondent talking specifically about staging and about the concert hall setup as being just kind of at odds often with what is actually performed. That this format was for her unimaginably stiff. She didn't really understand why any music is performed in this way. And I thought that was an interesting. I think that was a young composer at on the Darmstadt summer courses. And I think that is another perspective on that setup. Do we even need it at all? And this is also a good time to think about that as well. What is concentrated listening if there are also no live audiences? And there's also much kind of dissatisfaction or a lot of comments about gender balances on programming, and quite a few specific issues mentioned there, especially among that kind of younger community. But in general, I think that's also another direction for research, to ask composers a bit more about what they think, what the role of the audience actually is, and what their connection to it is. I mean, has been existing research, for example, on improvisers and how they view audiences, and for them there was reported quite strongly that even though the rehearsal may not differ that much from the concert in terms of the kind of musical experience or the performance experience, having that audience there was then suddenly also, in terms of like the content that they might have produced when they were there, the audience, it took on a different feel. It had a kind of an emotional significance that rehearsal didn't have. And there is also research, I think, by Jennifer Radbourne on what audiences think their role is, and they reported that to offer an emotional response, so some kind of emotional connection, and that is so important for many people, as difficult in this time, or it's difficult to really produce a kind of emotional musical experience remotely. So I hope that kind of responds to some of your points. I don't know if Sarah, if you have anything to already report from your COVID research.
Yeah, I mean, just generally, I would kind of echo your points, that I think so similarly in doing a study on contemporary arts, the situation is very similar, where if you go to a contemporary dance piece, there's lots of professionals in the audience. If you go to a very new experimental exhibition opening, there's a lot of professionals there. So likewise, I talked to a fair number, although we tried not to get too many. And I guess perhaps why I am banging the drum for making everything as kind of accessible and engaging as possible to a wide as possible audience, is because that really did come across as the absolute priority for the people that we spoke to. And I think, it could also be a kind of a difference in, certainly in the UK, that is kind of all everyone is talking about at the moment, is how we can make sure the publicly funded arts that are available are and engaging with all those people. But just talking, when you were saying about venues, I think the key behind all of this is that it's done with integrity, and so it's done in a setting that makes sense for the work that's on offer, and it's done with genuine attempts at engagement. And I think the digital performances that have happened with COVID have very much showed the same thing, where ones that haven't done so well are the ones where people have just carried on as normal but put up a camera, whereas actually things that are trying to use that platform in new and interesting ways and engaging people in ways that wouldn't be possible just in a kind of silent concert hall have been quite exciting and have reached kind of audiences beyond what they would do if you know, geographically or the kinds of people who wouldn't be able to get to a concert hall. So yeah, sorry, I think in a roundabout way give us the similar points.
Yes, unfortunately we are already a little bit over time. So if there is a very urgent last question, this is the moment. Otherwise, I think we will have to wrap up here.
I would really love to have additional questions, but I would probably say, what would you, Gina, think, what should we research next? I mean, now we do not have sort of research in Ulysses 3, but basically, what would be the next thing you would sort of like say we should contemplate?
Yeah, oh, it's a shame to hear that there won't be research as part of Ulysses 3. Yeah, I think there is much more room to get that composer perspective on audiences and on these issues that we've all of us have discussed in this the last 20 minutes, that they're around diversity, around opening up new music. How do they feel about it? I'm sure there are a lot of different opinions, as I kind of referenced those comments at Darmstadt and Time of Music. Those, you can find all of those in the dissertation, but there were quite, I mean, there, for example, there's been that the movement, the Gender Relations in New Music movement that came out of that, and I document there, for example, a bit of a kind of back and forth between people who are pro Grinham and people who are anti Grinham, and that's kind of also, yeah, very interesting to see how much, I mean, contemporary music and contemporary classical music, new music, whatever you want to call it, since the start of the 20th century has always provoked such a rich debate from critics, from composers, and that kind of discourse around it is something I think is just very important, very unique, and a lot of thought, and has always been part of this. what comes along with this music, about what does it mean, what it stands for, who does it actually speak to? And I think looking specifically at that composer audience relationship and research would be very interesting. This could even be taken as far as looking at composer intentions and seeing how those aligned with the audience experience or didn't in specific case study formats. I think that could be an interesting angle. I think there's also room to look at the field as a kind of subculture and this insider outsider perspective. I think that's also a line for further research. So those are some things I would discuss, but I would also encourage you all to continue asking your audiences what they think and about the experiences that they have, as best you can. It can be very simple, even something as simple as a postcard or a digital postcard, inviting comments or just answering a few questions gives you an impression of who was actually there and what they thought, and then that already creates a way of kind of slightly democratizing the experience and curation, and kind of gives you a kind of a realm for feedback and a kind of feedback loop to occur. So I think those would be my recommendations. But it was such a pleasure to work with all of you and to be part of this, and it's been wonderful to have this remote, and it's always slightly bizarre, but to have this remote meeting. And yeah, as I said, hopefully the research report will remain online for a while, and there will be eventually a book publication on all of this work as well.